What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your favorite NEC electrical instructor. And on today's episode of Ask Paul, we're going to target a question that was submitted to me that's talking about a change in the 2020 NEC, and I'm going to answer their question. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you want to get a more in-depth understanding of the National Electrical Code, I mean, more than just surface code, just more than I think somebody said this, I think somebody said that. But you really want to be able to look in somebody and say, that's BS, because I know the code. Then what you need to do is you need to go over to our website. It's electricalcodeacademy.com.net or .org, whichever you choose, or masterthenec.com.net or .org, whatever you choose, and get into our program called the Fast Tracks. Now, this is a program that's designed to teach you the NEC. Many people use it for exam preparation, but the program itself is designed to give you a broader understanding of the National Electrical Code. Of course, part of that also gives you access to our weekly sessions where I am with you live each week. So that gives you access to that as well. So that's a bonus. Now, if you're not into the program, you don't really think you need the Fast Tracks program. Of course, we have residential, commercial, industrial, grounding and bonding, and even Electricity 101 over there to kind of hone your skills better as a residential electrician, or maybe you want to get all of your electricians on the same page and you really subscribe them to our residential program. If you're the administrator, we'll give you a report of how the students do each week. And there's many things you can do over on our website. And again, we have a lot of options for you, from big companies to small mom and pops to the individual who wants to learn the code or to learn residential, commercial, and all those other things in a little more in depth. Then we have the program for you over there. All of that under the umbrella of Electrical Code Academy. All right. Now, if you just want to get all of our latest videos, all of our latest podcasts that are very technical driven, not these that are done for free, but our technical stuff, then go over and think about subscribing on our website. You go to our website, again, electricalcodeacademy.net.com or .org, doesn't matter. And up at the top, you'll see a subscribe button in the navigation. Click subscribe. Again, it's $9.99 a month. You can cancel at any time, or you can opt for the annual purchase, which is, I think it's $119, and that gives you access for an entire year. Those type of things. That one you can't cancel. Once you subscribe it and you get access, it's good for a year. Okay. And you can choose not to renew it after a year if you don't feel like you're getting your value out of it. But there's hundreds of videos over there, hundreds of podcasts. It's where we're going to be sharing all of our more in-depth technical stuff there rather than out on YouTube anymore. So that's where you need to go. It's less than $120 a year. That's a textbook, okay? And we're giving you way more than what you'd get in a textbook, okay? So if you're interested in those things, go check it out, okay? All right, so what we have here is, most people know that if you have questions here at Ask Paul, that you want to go over to our website, paulabernathy.com, and on there's a portal. And on that portal, you put in your question, your information, and you click the submit button. It comes to me, and I will either answer your question via email, or I will answer it in a podcast. And today, we have a podcast. And it's going to be a pretty simple one. So usually my podcasts are pretty long, but this one might be short. The question was simple. It asked, Paul, I heard that in the 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code that the 6 disconnect rule disappeared. Is that true? Okay, great question. It is about a code change that took place in the 2020. So I figured I would explain what took place, because the 6 disconnect rule, if I had to give you a summary, you want the 35,000 foot view. The 6 disconnect rule didn't go away. It just kind of went away for a specific application that was pretty common through the years to be done. And I used to see it a lot on data centers and large industrial complexes where they had really big services. And obviously they had multiple services to a building. So they were able to have multiple services because of the capacity needs. Again, that in 230, you can see all those rules. This was a very common application, and it disappeared in the 2020 edition. Of course, all the manufacturers have to scramble in order to meet this, but I'm going to explain why they don't have to work too hard to do this, because you can still use that equipment as a remote distribution panel, but just not as a service equipment. All right, that's a lot of teasers, right? That's a lot of teaser information for about this topic. So if you've got your code books, and those that don't, I will paint you a mental picture, as I always do. We're going to be working in Article 230 for this question, and we're going to be very much embedded in the requirements of 230.71. And this is the maximum number of disconnects. Now, in the 2020 edition, there's a little bit of a structure change here. We have an A and a B, and it's broken down into your general rules. All right, and then it's broken into where you got the 2 to 6 service disconnecting means. Again, 2 to 6 means more than one. Okay, so if you just have your one disconnect, okay, then you're not gonna look at 230.71b. Okay, but you still have the general requirements of 230.71a. That's the general rules, and of course, if you only had the one, then you didn't need to go to 230.72, which is the grouping of disconnects, because you obviously only have one. So we're very much talking about the 6 disconnect rule here. Okay, so the up to 6. Now, here's what it says. I'm going to read it to you in 230.71. Maximum number of disconnects. Each service shall have only one disconnecting means, unless the requirements of 230.71b are met. Okay, so this is telling me you only have one service to a building, only one. Okay, however, if you're going to meet the requirements of 230.71b, which is the 2 to 6 service disconnecting means, which we still have the allowance of the 6 disconnect rules, it says you have to follow all of those rules. So we're assuming, based on the question that was submitted, we have an application where it's 2 to 6. So we're going to go straight to 230.71b, which is the 2 to 6 service disconnecting means. Now, the first thing you'll notice, the code savvy person will look and say, wow, all that is grayed out. And the gray means that there is a change to the 2020 edition of the NEC. Okay, that's the first thing. And if you ever forget that, folks, go down to the bottom. And the NFPA does a good job here in publication of this document, because it tells you that there's the diamonds, for example, the triangles, the deltas, they tell you that there was some deletions in the text. Some type of revision. Okay, it's great. You can look at the previous cycle and kind of see what's changed if you want. And then, of course, it tells you if there's anything new, it would have an M beside it. But everything that's highlighted is a revision. So that's shaded text. Something in there has been changed, moved around, or done something. So if you're working in a cycle that's not yet adopted in your area, like say you're in 2017, but you're working out of 2020 because you just want to be a forward thinker, anytime you would look up something in the code and you see this gray, you'd have to stop for a minute and go, okay, I'm going to have to go back to my older edition that is current right now in wherever jurisdiction I'm in and see what it is. So that's why I tell people it's okay to go to the next cycle. Just be aware that anytime you see something that's grayed out, that you're going to have to make a reference back to the previous edition to see what the code was there, right? Okay. If you don't see any gray, then there was really no change. If you don't see an N in the margin, then it wasn't new. So that's new material for this edition. Now, the reason that you see N's in the margin and then you don't see the text being highlighted beside the N in your code book is because we only highlight changes. And new means it was brand new. So there is nothing to highlight. That's a whole new section. Okay. So that's the reason why you see it like that. All right. So let's kind of read it. 2 to 6 disconnect rule, because again, the emphasis here is we did not do away with the 6 disconnect allowance here. It says 2 to 6 service disconnects shall be permitted for each service permitted by 230.2. That's the one that allows you, because you can only have one unless, of course, you meet some of the conditions that are under 230.2 to have more than one. Or for each set of service entrance conductors permitted by 230.40 exception number 1, 3, 4, or 5. It says the 2 to 6 service disconnecting means shall be permitted to consist of a combination of any of the following. Okay. So before we look at number 1, number 2, number 3, let me kind of paint you the picture of what this is doing away with, and then we'll look at what this is allowing you to do, which is still the 6 disconnect rule, by the way. It was very common to bring a service in, whether it's parallel runs or whatnot, into, and I'll use a data center for an example, where they might come, well, you know what, data center's not the best, because usually now they're all switchboarded and switch geared and that type of thing. So an industrial facility like a Michelin plant or something that has a lot of power usage, things like that, they would come in with these service conductors, and it would come into a single large cabinet. And inside of that cabinet, they might have 6 individual large circuit breakers. They might be 1,000 amps each. I don't know. Okay. They might be 600 amps each, but it's in one cabinet, one single cabinet. So you have the bus assembly, which is in the cabinet that these breakers will go into. And then from there, because of the 6 disconnect rule, those were your service. And then from there, it goes out to feeders to other remote distribution panels throughout the facility. So this was huge because you could have a single cabinet, and some of them can be quite large, and have 6 breakers in there. And that met the 6 disconnect rule. And, they could theoretically be 1,000 amps each. So it's a 6,000 amp application where you have one cabinet. Okay, just kind of painting you that mental picture. And that was very common for distribution to be able to do it that way. And you could have multiples to a facility because if 230.2 and the size of the facility and the capacity, the HJ would be okay with it, and then I could have multiple ones placed out throughout the facility. So, and again, this also would apply to that 230.40 exceptions, which is very common to allow service interconductors, as long as they stay outside, to have them go like on the side of a building and then terminate into separate panels, let's say in apartments, and then you would have the 6 disconnect rule in that apartment. But as long as those service entrance conductors stayed outside, they were still service entrance conductors, if you will, till they penetrate the structure, that type of thing. So anyway, that's what the 230.40 exception is all about. Maybe we'll cover that in another podcast, or maybe on a video on our website. All right, so we know that the very common application of putting 6 disconnects in a single cabinet was very common. However, 2020 code, you can't do it anymore. And so the person that submitted that question is absolutely right when it comes to a single cabinet. And remember that panel in your garage, right? That panel that's in your building that has your main breaker in it, let's say, and all your individual breakers and things like that. They're inside of a cabinet. So that's what I'm talking about. All right, so again, I just painted you a picture of a big one. Now let's look at what applications are still permitted to do the 6 disconnect rule. And never forget that we're under services here. So don't let the mind start wandering to feeder applications, because that still would allow you to have the 6 breakers in it and do that type of thing. Okay, because it's protected upstream by an overcurrent device. So this rule is not going to apply to that. This is only services. So what we've got 4 items here. So the first one that's allowed for the 2 to 6 disconnect, or permitted, I should say, for the 6 disconnect service, 6 service disconnecting means, number 1, separate enclosures with a main service disconnecting means in each enclosure. So an example of this might be if I'm coming from a transformer underground, coming up on the side of the building, and I have 6 separate service panels, all grouped in the same location. So each one of them had their own main breaker. So for lack of, keep it visual in our, keep a mental picture, this would be like 6 panels, 200 amp panels with a main breaker, right? A main service disconnect. And it's a NEMA 3R, whatnot, outside. And they're all beside each other. I could have up to 6 of them, and that would be fine. So that's still okay. That's still permitted. And most people would say, well, Paul, maybe I'm just going to come up and hit a 200 amp main disconnect. And because those are smaller, thinner, narrower, and they're service listed for use as service equipment or SUSE rated, and I'm going to stack them all right there. Perfect. Because once you get on the load side of those, then it's just feeders going through the building, and that's okay. Feeders can go through the building. Service conductors cannot. All right, so, and I say that with an asterisk, because service conductors could go through the building as long as they're encased in concrete or they meet some other rule that would make it be considered outside of the building. Okay, and so you'd have to go look at the beginning of 230 to determine, all right, well, what makes something outside of the building? What's do I do to have something to be considered, this is considered outside of a building? Well, in order for you to do that, you're going to have to go look at 230.6, and you've got some conditions there that to be determined. And again, like I said, one of them would be underneath the building, where it's 18 inches of earth, and just 2 inches of concrete encasement or things, or beneath 2 inches of concrete. There's different rules to go look at it to be considered outside of a building. Okay. Definitely not the topic of today's episode. Okay. So all the haters out there, dude, it's not the topic. Okay. Grow up. All right. So that was number 1. So 6 separate enclosures with the main service disconnect in each one of the enclosures, perfectly fine. Number 2, panel boards with a main service disconnecting means in each panel board enclosure. Okay, so the first one was separate enclosures with the main service disconnecting means. So I gave you an example of panels. That's probably going to be more under number 2. The first one would be separate enclosures with the main. That might be those ones, like I said, with the 200 amp main breaker only inside of it. There's no panel board structure. That's just the breaker, right? That'd be an example of that one. And of course, number 2 is a panel board. So you could have 6 panel boards right there inside of an enclosure with a main main service disconnecting means in each one of them. Perfectly fine. Could do that before, you can still do that. The next one is dealing with switchboards. Switchboards where there is only one service disconnecting mean in each separate vertical section, where there are barriers separating each vertical section. So if you have a switchboard configuration, the manufacturers would have to sell it as such, and you have 6 separate vertical sections that are separated by barriers. Okay. If that's the case, then each one of those are considered separate. So that's kind of like having 6 separate enclosures, if you will. And if you have a one service disconnecting means in each one of those vertical sections, then there you go. And of course, they're designed, they'll be grouped, obviously, because they're all in the same switchboard. Not a problem. The next one is service disconnects in switch gear or metering centers where each disconnect is located in a separate compartment. So this is what happens when you have switch gear. Usually each one of those compartments are isolated out because it's its own compartment with barriers all around it. So as long as you don't have more than 6, then that would be okay for you to do this in switch gear. Now, the one that I probably see the most is probably the meter center applications, where you're going to have the meter and it's integrated meter and actually integrated with a lower portion of it that has maybe the service disconnecting means in it. And you can buy these in a 2, 4, even 6 configuration for like apartment complexes with 6 meters. And underneath it, you have your breakers. Okay. So this example would be perfectly okay under the metering center for that, as long as it doesn't exceed 6. Now, of course, if you want more than 6 for an apartment complex, then what do? You have a service disconnect up ahead of all that, right? And probably going to have, then when it comes off of that, those are now feeders. And of course, you can have whatever number, depending on your load calc and whatever your distribution is, you can have any number of apartments, each leg or whatnot. But in order to meet this rule with a meter center up to 6, this would be an example where I'd have a meter stack that might have 6 meters on it and 6 service disconnects on it. Each one of those are in their own separate enclosures. They're all obviously grouped in the same location. Boom, right there. This is that rule. Right? So that allows you to continue to do that. So these are things that were allowed before. The only thing that's been removed and is the ability to have the 6 breakers, let's say, and I'll just use breakers for simplicity, 6 circuit breakers in a single cabinet and following a 6 disconnect rule. That is no longer allowed for services. Still can do that for feeders, no longer allowed for services. Now, one of the things that confuse people is, why would we do this? And this is because if you think about it, that whole bus is energized. Even if you remove an overcurrent device, it's still energized. And so there was really no way of killing power to it for the electrician aspect of it. And that's who we're trying to protect in this scenario, of those that would work on it, maintenance folks or whatever. So that's where you would have that concern. And so this eliminates that concern. Again, there is no concern on the load side, right? Because downstream, you could turn off a breaker that's protecting the feeder, and you'd be okay. Everything downstream would be dead. But when it comes to the service, again, there's really no effective way of turning that off. And so by removing something, it just keeps a bus that's totally energized regardless of removing a breaker, right? And you can't turn power off to that bus. So that is a hazard. So that's why that has been adopted into here. And that's a requirement now for the 2020 edition. Again, so you saw we have options. You still have the options you probably have done before. It's effectively getting rid of that ability, again, to do the 6 disconnect rule inside of a single cabinet. But it does not remove the ability under 4 options here to do it separate enclosures, separate panel boards with the service disconnecting means, switchboard with separate vertical sections that are barriered, and you have a service disconnect, only one in each one of those vertical sections, or if you have a metering center up to 6, as long as the service disconnecting means is isolated in a separate compartment. And again, goes also the same for switchgear. Okay, so interesting code change. Hopefully you're on board with it and you understand it. And again, we only really saw these in industrial applications and large commercial applications because that was a lower cost way to bring distribution of power into a building than to go with bigger switchgear and all those type of things. But again, depending on the capacity and the size of the facility, that's just what some folks would do. Can you do it anymore in the 2020 code? Absolutely not. So hopefully you got something out of that, folks. Until next time, stay safe and God bless. And don't forget, you can submit your questions to me over at paulabernathy.com, where I will answer those questions in either a podcast or an email. Till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.